Thank you very much, Dr. Doshna. That's a kind of jangling honesty that's very refreshing. I've never heard this from an American diplomat.
Well, I'm not a diplomat.
Ex-diplomat then.
Yeah, ex-diplomat.
But it's really quite refreshing because I think that is the truth, as most people would see it. Before we have everybody, just a thought occurred to me. Development aid was a big part of your foreign policy at one time.
Absolutely.
And India benefited hugely in times past. That's not the case anymore. The development aid budget has been hugely cut.
Right.
I know this is a very general kind of issue, but how do you think that will impact? I know the answer. I think everybody here knows the answer, but nevertheless, I'll have you talk about it. What's the impact you think when there is no money to dole out in terms of development assistance, technical assistance, those kinds, food assistance?
Yeah, well, I alluded to this kind of black and white, non-subtle thinking where there's only good and bad and there's no gray areas. And I think all of us with it in our academic training, when we studied at the university, one of the first things that our professors disabused us of was black and white thinking. And we were always taught to look at shades of gray and to see overlap between things. And so he has, and because it's a non-scientific administration, they feel that they can just throw out scientific thinking and social science no longer plays any role. You can just make a bland assertion. So if you turn on Fox TV in the United States, I don't know if you're familiar with Fox TV, it's just 24-hour propaganda that just never stops. And they'll tell you this, everything is black and white when you watch Fox TV. And sociologists have done endless studies about the impact of watching Fox all day long does to your thought processes. But if you're thinking in black and white terms and you're not scientific, they're absolutely convinced that the United States spends enormous amounts of money on foreign aid and development, and that all this money is just wasted. And of course that contradicts all research. Every country, like Scandinavian countries, give 10, 15 times per capita more foreign aid than the United States, and they reap enormous benefits from that foreign aid. When I was serving in Iraq with the Italians, we were instructing Iraqi farmers on how to do modern agriculture, and one of the ways that they did modern agriculture was by getting a free Italian tractor. And Trump would say, oh, we're giving away free tractors, we're wasting all that money. And any agricultural specialist would say, well, once you have that tractor, you're going to be buying parts for the rest of your life. And that's the smartest thing you can do, is to give a free tractor to someone. So we're talking people whose worldview is so simplistic that they can't understand that a foreign development aid actually benefits the provider of that aid as more than the recipient of the aid, actually.
An ex-diplomat from the Indian side.
One very simple question. I mean, I know, like Bharat, I agree with what you said, but whichever we take it, the fact is that he is a president of the USA, and we have to live with that situation till he remains the president of the USA. But it's 2 years or 6 years. However, as a country, one can always be optimistic and look forward to change in the position of the country once he leaves. Do you think the impact that he makes on the foreign policy, particularly because he represents a nationalist conservative group, and they are now really having the same influence in the, how irreversible is that impact?
Well, I'm actually a big defender of the American political system. I think that the stars were in alignment for Donald Trump in 2016, and that alignment will never happen again in American history, and that his political career is over. For 2 years, he's going to limp along, and he'll either be discarded by the Republicans or renounced by the American voters, because whatever bad press the Americans have gotten in the last 2 years in the American political system, we're also showing fantastic resilience, and it's starting to really come out now. My experience has been, I served under both Republicans and Democrats, and when each new administration came in, they thought they were going to change everything. And then when we again, the new administration came in and changed everything. And as professional diplomats, we just did what they wanted, and we changed everything. And because we're professionals, we can do it very quickly. And by the time Trump leaves, there'll be such an overwhelming distaste for everything that he's done that there'll be an eagerness by the vast majority of the American people to have all these policies discarded and to go back to the international mainstream and what we call international norms. I mean, we don't have time today to go through the whole question of international norms. I mean, that would be like a whole semester. But I think we're gonna make a pretty fast shift in the post-Trump era, and the United States that emerges is going to be much closer to Western Europe than it is today. And my children and grandchildren will be living in a state that resembles more Germany than what we see now.
Wonderful. General Sehgal?
My question follows my ambassador's question, and I have heard your talk and your answer to him. I've written a lot of articles on Mr. Trump, and the latest one which I am writing now, Donald might go, Trump is here to stay. And the reason is that some of his policies, whether other Republicans come or Democrats come, like immigration, the wall border with the Americas, some of them are not going to change, and a few others. Foreign policy, yes, like he said, he will get back into with Japan and everybody else, but some domestic policies, I think, for a long time are irreversible.
Well, my take on that is that what we're seeing is a demographic problem in the United States, in that there's a huge demographic shift. We're seeing a browning of America. We're going to see a white minority America within my lifetime, and my children and grandchildren have no, that doesn't even get on their radar screen. It's people my age and older who are upset by all this, but people my age and older are on their way out, and it's going to be my children who are going to take over, and they're embracing a whole different view of what America is. So my reading of this is that this is the last gasp of a revisionist right-wing view of America. And it looks very ugly, but I think something really good is going to emerge maybe within a decade or so, maybe even in 2 years.
Anybody else? Yes, please.
Sir, thank you very much for your talk. My question is very simple, that are you in the favor of migration? Because the entire Europe, all people in the world, they are towards nationalism, and the migration, specifically illegal and moving without any borders, just leave aside the Europe, where it is possible because of their, inherent intrinsic values. But do you see this as a phenomena which is growing, and there is protest all over the world? And do you find that whatever Trump is doing for his countrymen? So how do you rate on this account to him by yourself?
I'm from Arizona, and it's a multicultural state. 40% of Arizonans are Hispanic, 10% are Native American. And we've lived in a multicultural society in Arizona for a long time, and we couldn't imagine living without Latinos. If we had to live in an Anglo society where everyone was white and spoke English, it would be unimaginable for us. And I just can't. This idea that Americans want to turn back the clock. In Arizona, where the Republican Party pushed this immigration issue so hard, Trump carried the state by 3%. In 2016, which was one of the lowest percentages of any state that he carried. So obviously, the white Arizonans, we call the Anglos, the white people, they weren't as upset as the Republican Party thought they would be, or as Trump thought they would be. So if he can't get traction in Arizona, he's not going to get traction anywhere. They say that the states that are most upset about immigration are states where there is no immigration. States like Iowa and Nebraska, where you have 90% white people, and they've never met a brown person. And so they have all kinds of crazy notions about what a brown person is. And people in Arizona, we've lived with Latinos all our lives, and so we just think of them as our neighbors. We don't think of them as anything different from us. So the number of states that are all white is very small and shrinking in the United States. So I don't think it's going to be a major problem. The big problem is that we have to have an equitable economic system around the world so that places like Honduras and El Salvador have viable economies so that their people don't have to immigrate illegally to the United States to find work. But you have to keep in mind that the so-called illegal workers have lower crime rates than native-born Americans. They're harder working than native-born Americans, and their children are much more successful in school than a lot of native-born Americans. So without immigration, our country would be a lot worse off than it is now.
Yes, same thing I will continue. I think it's a sense of insecurity suffering from this president after 9/11. And F1 visa, 4 and F4 visa, they are not only, they are talented people, they are the best brain of the world. India contributes a huge doctors, engineers, scientists. NASA is a 40% Indian scientists. The same are very respectable doctors. So how this society is going to take it rest of the time?
Right.
How they will cope? Do you think US economy can survive without Indian or migrant people?
We would be far worse off, because one of the reasons why we were able to be the world hegemon for such a long time, this is a whole nother class, but I don't believe we'll be the world hegemon for much longer. But we're going to be a leading world power throughout the rest of our lifetimes. Is because we were able to have a multicultural society where we were able to integrate people. And the big issue, and I hear this from Indians all the time, is that the United States is a meritocracy, and you really can get ahead by working hard, and you don't have to bribe people, you don't have to be related to someone, you don't have to belong to a particular religion or a caste or something. It's just you go in and you take the test, and if you impress the people, they hire you, and they give you a grant, and they give you a lab, and they take you to the think tank, and they don't ask about they don't care about your national origin or whatever. So that's a real strong point in the United States, and I think it's going to survive Trump, and it's just going to keep right on forging ahead. And in that regard, the United States is the model for the world of the future, because in the future we're going to see a breakdown of borders anyway. People are going to be migrating all over the world and dictated by labor markets. So.
Yes, please.
John, you spoke about the groups of Protestant evangelists, which are really having a lot of impact on minority relations across the world. Trump may be alluding to the idea, but he doesn't really contribute much.
Right.
I would go back to Obama's administration also, when the Democrats were in power. As far as the minorities in India are concerned, and I'm talking about India, there was a lot of change post the present government. And there were a lot of issues related to the Christian minorities, besides, of course, the other minorities. That visit of Obama to India changed a lot of complexion regarding one particular community. But I don't find much of a change since the Trump administration has come into power. of protecting the minorities, be it in India, South Asia, or other parts of the region. So I would like you to comment as to how Trump is contributing towards this agenda, especially in India.
Well, what I was alluding to was that there's some doublespeak among the Trump administration, because they talk about that they want to protect religious freedom around the world, but then they don't practice what they preach, because religious freedom means, we're talking about the liberal worldview, it means anyone who's oppressed for their religious views, regardless of their religion. But he differentiates. He puts a higher premium. He puts a lower premium on Muslims than on others. He comes out and says, I don't want Muslim immigration to the United States. I don't want Muslims to live in the United States. So that it has a very ugly impact on our foreign relations. That's what I was alluding to. And this whole idea of does the tail wag the dog? Do evangelical Christians in the United States have far more political influence than their numbers dictate? I think we do see that, because the United States has a religious freedom commission that's part of the State Department that has not done anything for any religious group except for Christians. So I mean, that's the doublespeak I was alluding to. But whether you're a better judge of this than me as to how active the U.S. Embassy or the U.S. government has been in protecting minority rights. I can't imagine the Trump administration being very upset about the way Muslims are being treated in India.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
When candidate Clinton was asked whom she would prefer to have her enemy, she also replied Iran. And was there a necessity for candidate Clinton to name it? My point is that there is certain deep state within this state. And as you said, despite lip service, so it has been a very killing policy to constructed enemies.
Right.
And so therefore that way, despite this kind of change of lips, there is a kind of a continuation of the apparatus of the deep state, which has domestic implications, the military-industrial complex, and its international ramification. So therefore, the transformation of American policy requires an acknowledgement of that deep state, both domestically and internationally. My second query is that you are a great supporter of our political system, but what about certain fundamental deficit, for example? Now, is it that on the one hand, America has some robust institutions, but what is happening to these institutions?
That would be a whole nother.
And
That would be a whole nother class, yeah.
And how is that? Is it that American institutions are so weak
Right.
that a president can dictate terms?
Yeah.
And my final query is about evangelism. That I have done my study on Habitat for Humanity. The point is that the Christian space is also a multidimensional space.
That's right.
Therefore, what kind of inner and lateral conflicts of interpretations that these evangelicals are confronted with, and what is its implication even the whole Christian voting space?
Yeah, because there are liberal Christian denominations and there are conservative Christian denominations. There are 2,500 denominations in the United States, and liberal Christians are very happily vote Democrat. They're very strong supporters of gay rights and women's rights and civil rights. And so we're only talking about one segment of this huge group of denominations that is supporting the Republican Party because they have very specific social concerns. And they also have theological concerns, which we don't have time to go into, dealing with the apocalypse and the end times and the Middle East and the Antichrist and on and on. But So yeah, my point is that he doesn't even have a pro-Christian agenda. He's pandering to this group that votes for him that he has nothing in common with. I mean, he doesn't share their value system, but it's strictly for him a way of gaining political influence. And so he's very happy to help them ban abortion and help them curtail rights for homosexuals if they vote for him. And so it's a Machiavellian bargain. That's what I'm saying.
It's more opportunism.
Yeah. Yes, on both sides. Both sides are being opportunistic because I can't believe that these evangelical leaders actually believe that Donald Trump is their savior or that he shares any of their religious views or morality or anything else. But
What about the other two questions?
our democracy has been undermined. That's why why Trump was able to win the election, because we have these odd things like the Electoral College. So Hillary Clinton can win by 3 million votes. And if we hadn't have had the Electoral College, she would have won by a landslide. But because of this odd Electoral College thing, which is a historic remainder from our slavery days, he was able to get the electoral votes to squeeze by. And then the other thing, this takes forever to talk about, but they've gerrymandered the political system, which is a way of undermining democracy. And because white supremacists have embraced the Trump agenda, they're trying to work systematically to deny votes to people of color, which is a huge blot on the American democratic system. But if that's not corrected, my optimism regarding the American political system would be severely undermined. But we're seeing some correction going on, and I think once Trump is gone, a lot of these things are going to be discarded.
To be fair, though, I think the Electoral College, we have one too, and we got it from the American system. But the political logic there was that smaller states would have the political weightage. Otherwise, you would have the crowd, the overpopulated or demographically heavy states dictating terms. So, in some sense, there's more than just the slavery aspect. At least, the Electoral College has utility. Democratic and political utility. That's it, yes.
Thank you, sir. My question is, can we see a Trump phenomena in context to where America want to counter rising Chinese economic and political structural position in the world, where Trump want to renegotiate U.S. economic relations to the world?
Yeah, I didn't even allude to that. And you even, in your write-up, you even mentioned Afghanistan, which I don't think I even mentioned once. But this whole idea that the United States is a declining hegemon, it's declining in the sense that we're leaving the unipolar world and we're re-entering the multipolar world, which isn't a bad thing because a unipolar world is never going to last long anyway. I mean, it was totally anomalous. So that's not a bad thing. But what Trump is doing is by having such an erratic foreign policy, he's actually undermining our ability to retain our influence in the international system. And he's creating a vacuum which the Chinese are very happy to fill. And so in that sense, we're shooting ourselves in the foot and committing national suicide. I'm not saying that the Chinese want to eradicate the United States or anything, but it's undermining our ability to play our rightful role as a world power on the world stage. Yeah. And so the Chinese gain more power and they can dictate more and more to the United States.
Thank you, Professor, for your candor and for also admitting the American hypocrisy, which many of us talk about. So my question is more about on the economic front. A cursory glance of the debate that happened before Trump became president looked like from that discussion, on both sides of the parties, there was a little bit of revision of the position of a globalized economic stance.
Right.
So how much do you think is a permanent shift? It's not just Trump is creating the trade barriers, because at the WTO level we have been conflicting over multiple things for more than 15 years, right? So how much do you think is that the revision of the American position of a globally connected economy is a permanent change now that many of the other countries, particularly China, is reaping benefits of that globalized trade system?
Right.
So do you think, yeah, do you think Trump going would change anything in that economic policy?
John, just hear the same, it's an allied question.
Is quite unfairly harsh on Trump.
No, because when you're talking about economic economists that I'm reading are saying that we're heading for a major recession in the United States by 2020, and that Trump's policies are going to make that recession come a lot quicker. They did a massive tax cut, which stimulated the economy, and that stimulus is just going to, it's like when you inject yourself with methadone or something, you get a high and you have that speed, but then it wears off and then you collapse afterwards. And that's what the economists are predicting, that we're going to have this recession coupled with massive deficit spending, which is how we're paying for the tax cut. And then we're going to be in a recession. We're going to be in a recession without any means to get ourselves out of the recession, which means the recession is going to last a lot longer. So it's fine to say that the economy is going great guns now, but you have to look over the longer term. And I would argue that globalization, you can't have globalization based on just endless consumption, making the United States the dumping ground for consumer items produced by exploited workers in developing countries. I mean, that's not a sustainable economic model. So you're going to have to come up with a sustainable economic model, which we don't have time to discuss today. But green economy is going to be a big role in that, because by embracing fossil fuel, he's just setting back the American economy and hurting the American economy. If he had embraced alternative energy, he could have sparked a whole economic renaissance in the United States, which the Chinese and hopefully the Indians will take advantage of.
Does that answer your question?
I was just curious to know your viewpoint on that, whether there will be a revision of those policies. Do you expect, or do you think it's just going to?
If you follow what's going on in the Democratic Party, there are the mainline Democrats, who are the Clintons, who are sort of like the last holdouts of the old generation, and then you have all these young Democrats coming up, and you have the Puerto Rican lady from the Brooklyn, who's the youngest congressperson ever in the history of the United States, and she represents the future, and people of her generation, they want to see a more socialist kind of America. So they want to see a more egalitarian America. They want to see a much broader social safety net. They want to get rid of a lot of these breaks that have allowed wealthy people to accumulate obscene amounts of wealth in the United States. So yeah, they're going to retool, I think, over the course of the next several decades. We're going to see a retooling of the American system, and we don't even know what the impact of climate change and global warming is going to be on the world economy. Is it even going to be feasible to load consumer items up in Shanghai and ship them all the way to Los Angeles and then ship them all over the U.S. to Walmarts so that Americans can fill their house with more and more stuff? That's just, I don't think that's going to last. It's not sustainable.
Yeah.
As a technology practitioner, I wanted to know your opinion of the role of Russia in the US elections, considering the very fact that the birth of internet was in the United States and the United States was not able to defend whatever happened.
Well, all the pundits are playing their cards close to the chest. Nobody wants to come out and say that the Republican Party or the Trump campaign is guilty of collusion with Putin. They're all saying, let's wait for the Mueller report. But I think increasingly they're saying even if there is no smoking gun, if there's no proof that Trump actually openly colluded with Russia, the connections between this Russian subterfuge effort, it's a classic Russian intelligence operation, and the Trump campaign's eagerness and willingness to work with Russia it is damning in and of itself. I mean, I would say for a majority of Americans, it would be sufficient to convince them to vote for the Democrats in the next election. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. I'm a latecomer though. Do you ever envision that there will be a world government before the rapture? Thank you.
Well, this is the what we discuss endlessly in class, because I think if you're going to teach liberalism and go back to classic liberalism and Voltaire and all that, I think if you're a liberal in your heart of hearts, you're an internationalist. You want to see the Star Trek world where we have a one world government and there are no longer international borders. And but I don't think liberals, what the conservatives in the United States accuse the liberals of trying to bring this about overnight. I don't think any liberals believe that this is going to happen in our lifetime or in the next 5 or 10 years. But I think if you scratch any liberal and speak to them at length about their beliefs, eventually they'll cough up and admit that they have a utopian vision. Because why believe in progress if you don't believe that you can take it all the way? I mean, you can't. Why just have incremental progress and say we're going to stop here? Which is what the whole Fukuyama end of history thing was, that we're living in paradise. That's almost Voltairean. We're living in paradise, so we don't need to change anything. And that turned out not to work out the way people envisioned.
Good evening, sir. So, don't you think this symptom of inward focus in U.S. foreign policy, which we are witnessing today, is due to the imperial overreach of Bush administration, which even Obama was confronted with? So how will things change if at all Republicans come in power, say 2 years or 6 years down the line? Democrats come to the power. How would this symptom be reversed? And next, you also said about U.S. being cozy with Saudi Arabia and not caring for human rights. Hasn't it been more or less the same always?
Yeah,
and
that's
also
that hypocrisy I was alluding to. Yeah.
And also this U.S. President Trump's attack on China and this trade spat. I think, sir, don't you think it is one way where Trump is trying to maintain a U.S. supremacy? Because if he had not adhered to Saudi Arabia, then there is chances of Saudi Arabia and China dealing in Chinese currency, so which could also lead to internationalization of yuan. So don't think these all dynamics also work into play? And like you said, we have to look into shades of grey. So don't you think these shades of grey are important while we discuss Trump or criticize his policy?
Yeah, this is the traditional argument that you find throughout IR, international relations. When you look at it as a discipline, are you going to be totally pragmatic and put your ideals aside, or are you going to stand up and fight for your ideals? And that's one of the basic premises of the international system, is that any nation state recognizes all the other nation states. They don't do a test. They don't say, unless you have democratic elections, we're going to shut our embassy down in your country and we're not going to have relations with you. That's not what recognizing another country means. Of course, this is very basic IR, but Yeah, so how far do you take this? And I was going to allude to this before, because you see this in action with Republicans, because their favorite whipping boy is Cuba, and they always talk about human rights abuse in Cuba. But when it comes to human rights abuse in a country like Saudi Arabia, which supplies massive amounts of oil, or China, where we have billions of dollars in foreign investment, suddenly human rights is not so important anymore. So they're manipulating human rights to try and attack this regime. Are they attacking this regime because it's a human rights abuser regime, or because it's a socialist regime? I mean, are they interested in capitalism, or are they interested in human rights? And are they happy with China because China is having an unrestrained capitalism without having to deal with democracy? Can you be so devoted to capitalism that you're willing to toss out human rights and democracy and have an autocratic capitalism, which is what China really is in essence, even though they pretend to be a communist state now?
Is anybody else? Yes.
The US Vice President, in a recent speech, talked about the Cold War II, the second, and that, you see, the Cold War I ended very smoothly without a single gun being fired, let alone a nuclear weapon. And that all happened because of American leadership demanding democracy and human rights. But because the Americans have now withdrawn from that demand, how can the Cold War II be won? Because it is of vital importance even for a country like India, because our problem with China is actually a problem because of totalitarianism in China. Their occupation of Tibet, which Nehru, people generally believe very foolishly, gave recognition to rather quickly because of his own left-wing views. And then he also kept Dalai Lama in India, which more or less shut his mouth. He should have facilitated transit of Dalai Lama to some neutral country in Europe, from where he could today be the strongest spokesman for human rights and democracy in China. But do you think that America can come back to this role of leadership of the democratic world?
Yeah, this in the fallout to the Mattis resignation, they were talking about what Trump foreign policy looks like, and they were talking about it being a very retrograde, hyper-nationalist kind of approach, where the only country that matters is the United States of America, and we don't care about any other country unless they're willing to do what we tell them to do. And so if you're going to try and implement that system, you're tossing out the entire international system as we know it. I mean, you're going back to the time when you had Nazi Germany and fascist Japan and the British Empire. I mean, that's a huge step backward. And this time, if I can't foresee that ever happening, but if that were to happen, we would dig ourselves in so deeply that as a race, humanity probably wouldn't be able to dig itself out again, because climate change and then the collapse of the international system would bring about traumatic effects that we could not recover from. So, yeah, that's why I can't envision that this Trump foreign policy that they just discovered today, and when he didn't have one before, is going to last very long. And it's just, like I said, I hate to use the same word over and over, it's just not sustainable.
Well, thank you very much. I think that's a wonderful talk, John, and a great interactive period. It is. Would you mind answering one last question? Okay.
What do you feel will be the future of American policy on illegal immigration post-Trump?
You have to do long-term studies, and and they do a lot of this in Arizona because we border Mexico, and we had massive immigration from Mexico in different times in our history, and we were part of Mexico before. And you can't allow a couple-year period to set your policy for the whole future, because any demographer will tell you that migration has a pull factor and a push factor, and you have a big push factor now in Central America. That's pushing Central Americans here, but there's no guarantee that this situation in Central America will persevere over the longer term. It used to be that massive numbers of Mexicans were immigrating into the United States, but as the Mexican economy has improved, there are actually more Mexican migrants returning to Mexico than there are coming into the United States. So if it can happen with a huge country like Mexico, it could certainly happen with 3 small countries in Central America, which is what's driving this whole phenomenon. I mean, I'm discounting things like refugee resettlement and Muslim migration, because you're talking about, in a country the size of the United States, Muslim migration is insignificant. I mean, it doesn't really have an impact on the country as a whole. I mean, a negative impact at least, yeah.
Can Mexico be a part of USA sometime?
Well, we tried that in 1848. We invaded Mexico, and we conquered Mexico, and we had a conference there in Mexico City, and we went over the option of whether we should try to absorb Mexico, and we decided against it. So instead, we only took my home state, New Mexico, California, huge chunks, Colorado, all that from. But those were the thinly populated parts. So if we didn't do it in the 19th century, we're certainly not going to do it in the 21st century.
Thank you. I think vis-a-vis Cold War II,
oh, yeah.
There'll always be there'll always be a Fukuyama II as well, assuming that happens with the same kind of presumptuousness, of a Fukuyama.
The end of history.
The end of history. So thank you very much again, John.
You're welcome.
Very kind of you to have come and interacted with the audience. And thank you all very much. It was a very interesting interaction. And I think it was really very vigorous, one of the more vigorous interactions that I have been part of. And I think it was much due to you, how you handled the subject matter.
Good.
Thanks again.
Oh, yeah.